Okay.
Hey everyone, welcome to the first 2022 edition of the Dan and Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
All right, Joe, well, we just got done with bowl season and, going over everything, it looks like we had a really competitive bowl pool between the two of us, and we'll reveal the winner of that at the beginning of the next segment that we do. But before we go into the winner and loser, of course, big stakes on this. If I lose, I have to wear a Georgia something, which I'll get from my friend of the show, Kyle, who's a big Georgia fan. And if you lose, you have to wear something Mississippi State related. So I know the drama's out there. We come back for our next podcast. We'll let everybody know who won. But Joe, speaking of the bowl season in general, what do you think was your favorite game that you watched the entire bowl season this year?
Definitely the Rose Bowl for me. I thought it was just so entertaining, high octane. It reminded me a lot of the Penn State USC Rose Bowl from about 6 years ago with Juju Smith-Schuster and Saquon Barkley. I think even Kirk Herbstreit or Chris Fowler said that during this year's game. But it was just so much fun. And we saw Ohio State, even with the opt-outs, they had just unbelievable wide receiver play. I mean, like as good as, it gets. And you had Utah play great. I thought it was awesome seeing them in the Rose Bowl for the first time in school history with Kyle Whittingham, who, is kind of quietly one of the best coaches in the country that people probably don't give credit to enough. And I just thought it was just an outstanding game and came right down to the wire.
Yeah, Joe, you're talking about Kyle Whittingham. My dad called me during the game and he's like, "Who's the Utah coach?" And I was like, "Kyle Whittingham." He's like, "He's still there?" I'm like, "Yeah, he's still there and he's still being consistent." And I mean, what a great game. They got out to that huge lead on Ohio State. And then Ohio State's just amazing wide receiver depth showed out. I mean, Jackson Smith and Jigba, who's their third best receiver, gets 330 yards receiving and 5 touchdowns in that game. And then Marvin Harrison Jr., yes, the Marvin Harrison son, is their 4th best receiver. And he goes out and gets over 100 yards. And I think he had like 4 touchdowns in that game too. Just a crazy game, a lot of points. And I mean, it was just so exciting because really you got to see Pac-12 football in that essentially, because that was the way that game rolled out. And CJ Stroud and the receivers got just a little bit of an edge on Utah. Although it's kind of sad because Cam Rising for Utah, their quarterback, was having such a great game, and then he got injured at the very end. But then, amazingly, the backup quarterback goes out and gets a touchdown pass of his own to get the lead, to get it tied up again for Utah. So I don't know if you can really say that caused the game because they only had one drive with the backup in, and he delivered. And then, of course, at that point, Ohio State was able to drive down, get the field goal to win the game.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely hated seeing Rising not be able to finish the game. But just an unbelievable game. And kind of the weird thing about, I thought, Saturday on New Year's Day was that those 3 games really felt, especially the Rose Bowl and the Fiesta Bowl, they felt more like playoff games than the playoff games themselves. And I don't know why that is. Like, I don't know why it is, Dan, that we can't get a playoff game that's even close to that level of competitiveness.
No, absolutely. I mean, how much would you have loved to have seen a game that was like Ohio State and Notre Dame as one of the playoff games? That was also a great comeback. I mean, you had a great comeback in the Sugar Bowl, or not the Sugar Bowl, in the Rose Bowl and in the Fiesta Bowl, because I think Notre Dame was up on Oklahoma State 28-7 at one point too. Interesting that both those games were at that margin. And Oklahoma State's defense, which had been so great all season, really struggled in the first half against Notre Dame. And I was already singing the praises of Marcus Freeman and what he did. And then in the second half, Oklahoma State just came out, and Spencer Sanders, I thought, played the best game he's had since he's been a Cowboy. I mean, he was excellent in that. He threw for over 300 yards, which you rarely see with him, and he rushed for over 100. And he's coming back to Oklahoma State for another season. I feel like he's been there like 10 years, but he's going to make it probably at least the 6th season being an Oklahoma State Cowboy. And just a great game for him. And I think really good for them going into the next season, building off what they had this year. Yes, they lose Jim Knowles as the defensive coordinator, but really the thing that held them back and the reason they didn't make the playoffs this year was because of Spencer Sanders as a quarterback. So if he can take that next step against what was a very good Notre Dame defense, then maybe that gives a hope that Oklahoma State can get that extra couple inches next year and make the college football playoff.
Yeah, I think they have a good chance. I think, you look at both them and Baylor are going to continue, I think, to be good programs next year. I don't think this year was a fluke for either team. But some other games that stood out to me, in addition to the New Year's Six, I look at the Tennessee Purdue game, which is absolutely phenomenal.
That was going to be my number one.
Yeah, I mean, that was a great one. I know you probably want to talk more about that one, but I mean, just some games I thought that, were just like a lot of times you'll get games like that, or even like, what was another one? Was it the Iowa? Who did Iowa play that was like pretty close?
It was Iowa and Kentucky.
Kentucky. Like you'll get some of these kind of random bowl games at times that maybe aren't quite as dissected that will sometimes be, really sneaky good.
Yeah, Joe, let's first get into that Tennessee Purdue game, which I was excited about from the beginning. You knew there wasn't going to be a whole lot of defense in that game, that it was going to be high octane, and it didn't disappoint. I mean, I think in the last 8 minutes of that game, there were 5 touchdowns scored. I mean, it was nuts. And then sadly, at the very end, Tennessee gets robbed. I mean, there's no way that you can look at that play and say that guy didn't score. I mean, every single angle you had, his ankle was clearly above the ground. He was pushing through, and really, what I thought was one of the best effort touchdowns I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, the guy was driving through 3 different people. He was maintaining his body status to where he didn't touch at all. I mean, really, just an amazing effort. And you hate that some official blew the whistle too early and ruined that play. And I really think that's something they need to teach officials, that they need to give the proper amount of time before they blow the whistle, because you ruin plays like that where it's obvious the guy scored and it cost Tennessee the game. That wasn't fair.
No, absolutely. I think we've talked about that even before. I want to say even when we had the radio show, we used to talk about officials blowing the whistle too prematurely and how, too often it kind of impacts, plays that could otherwise stand as touchdowns because, unfortunately, at the point that they blow the whistle, I guess there's just no going back. Right. So that's definitely unfortunate. So definitely felt bad for Tennessee. Another game I thought that was sneaky good early in the bowl season was, I think, Northern Iowa and Coastal Carolina was a really good game too.
Yeah, I mean, Coastal Carolina, another good season, not quite what they had last year. Joe, the last thing I was going to say about that Tennessee Purdue game is that happened in Nashville in the Music City Bowl, which is going to be probably 90% Tennessee fans at it. Although I will say I was in Nashville the last time Purdue was playing Auburn in the Music City Bowl, and they did bring a pretty good crowd. I was surprised at how many people I saw there. But the whole time, as soon as that game ended, I was like, officials, run for your lives. You're going to get drilled with golf balls. There's no way you're going to be safe from golf balls after this one. Because in that game, Tennessee fans had a legitimate gripe in that Music City Bowl. I mean, if you were going to bust out the putter, that was the game to do it, not the Ole Miss game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They certainly had a gripe here. And, to your point about Purdue versus Tennessee with the fan bases, yeah, you definitely expect Tennessee to try to, have a great turnout there. But, with Purdue, they really haven't been to many top-tier bowl games over the last 20 years since Breeze was there. Like, I guess probably the Music City is about the best bowl game they've been to in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, I can honestly say, Joe, I was shocked when I was up in Nashville, not going to that game. I was just up there coincidentally at the same time. I think we were visiting friend of the show, Chelsea, at that point. And when we were out in Nashville, we saw Purdue fans everywhere. I mean, they really came out, and everybody kept asking me if I was up there for the Auburn-Purdue game, and I wasn't, which, I mean, that was really a terrible football game, and I'm glad I didn't go to it. I think Auburn won that game like 63-14 or something. So I kind of thought, too, that Purdue was definitely going to play well in this game because the last image you had of them in the Music City Bowl was them getting destroyed by Gus Malzahn called offense. That's even more embarrassing right there. But speaking of Auburn and embarrassing, hey, and talking about having a home crowd, their awful performance in the Birmingham Bowl really just resonates throughout this offseason. I mean, I thought the way Auburn's season ended, getting that bowl game was kind of a gift, I thought. I mean, they didn't really even deserve that game against what I thought was a pretty good opponent in Houston. Losing 4 games in a row to end the year, I kind of thought they should have been in an even worse bowl game than that. And I will say it looks like the new stadium in Birmingham that UAB's playing in is nice. I drove by it on the interstate on my way up to Chattanooga. It looked really good. And I thought that was kind of a neat, chance for Auburn to get to play in front of what's going to be a large majority crowd. I mean, I think that was probably even more so than the Tennessee game, A lot of people came to that, and of course, a lot of Auburn people. And the defense came out despite all kinds of opt-outs. Roger McCreary had opted out. Ricochet Rabbit, Zacoby McClain had opted out of that game, and Owen Papo was hurt. And Chandler Wooden, who's a fifth-year senior, who I think is kind of an interesting story, he opted out of last season because of COVID, and he had just become a new father, and he didn't want to, risk possibly having his baby baby and wife get sick. And I thought it was a good reason for someone to opt out. Comes back for his fifth year, was a rotational piece, did a good job when he was in, but he got his starting duty in this game. Had a great interception, like an absolutely great interception, was the leading tackler of the team. And despite his effort, and I thought was a stellar effort by the defense, the offense just was terrible. And I don't know how to explain it because they didn't have a whole lot of opt-outs on offense. The offensive line opted out, but there wasn't any receivers out. Tank was in the game. So was Jarquez Hunter. And TJ Finley, I don't know if he still hadn't healed up. They said that he was fine going into the game, was just terrible.
Yeah. It was disappointing, all around. It was a good Houston team, though, I'll say that. Over 10 wins, the second best team in the AAC all season. And I heard a weird statistic today, and then we can, go back to the game. But there were three teams from the state of Texas this year that had 10 or more wins, counting Houston, along with Baylor and also UTSA. Not, the three teams you would think, like not involved in Texas A&M and Texas. And the other weird thing, Dan, is there was one other state that had 3 10-win teams in college football this year. And would you believe it was Utah, with Utah State, and BYU?
How about that? That is not the one I would have thought of. So, there's probably like only 3 colleges in Utah that I can even name.
I know. I would have guessed, I think, Ohio with that, with Cincinnati and Ohio State, and tried to think if there was one more. But yes, that was kind of the random stat of the day. But yeah, Houston, I thought they were a good team. I just, thought all year long they played well, but this is still a game, that I think we both picked Auburn to win. I expected Auburn to win. So, it's definitely, I think, kind of a disappointment, obviously. But what are your thoughts on kind of how Auburn finished the season, kind of going forward under the new coaching staff?
Yeah, I don't know, Joe. Right now, if I were to give a grade to the Auburn coaching staff last year, I'd give them a D+. It's hard for me to go any better than that. I think what I expected as an Auburn fan going in, what I would have been happy with was, I think, a 9-4 season. I think I would have been happy with. I'd have been very happy with a 10-win season, a 9-4 season with what we had coming back on defense, with Bo Nix returning, I think was expected. And anything less than that was going to be a little bit of a disappointment. And when they got to 6-2 in the middle of the year, they're playing Texas A&M with a chance to securely be in the catbird seat, to have a chance to win the SEC West going against Alabama later. I was really happy with the job that had been done. I looked at the Penn State game. I was at that game. Really great environment. Tough game, but I thought the players are well prepared for it. Georgia, I thought Georgia was just a great football team, and they were better than us, so that didn't bother me, and I thought they played hard. But then the A&M game, the defense played outstanding, and the offense was atrocious. That was the worst game that Bo Nix ever played, so he took steps back. Then you have the Mississippi State game where they blow the 28-3 lead, and that was absolutely inexcusable. First off, they can call me an elitist Auburn fan, but they shouldn't lose to Mississippi State to begin with. And, but even in years where Mississippi State is good, you can't blow a 28-3 lead. And this Mississippi State team was not a good Mississippi State team. They were just a very roller coaster Mississippi State team, as evidenced by their bowl loss to Texas Tech, where they weren't even competitive and lost 31-7 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so that game already was bad. Then you go to South Carolina and you lose to them for a second year in a row. Awful in the first season of Shane Beamer. The Alabama game, they were prepared, but then there was a lot of boneheaded coaching moves at the end of the game, which you and I have already talked about ad nauseum, so we don't need to get into that again. And then you move on and you have what happened in this bowl game. And I look back, and Joe, every single one of these games I mentioned, they had the lead. They had the lead in every single one of these games. And in 4 out of 5 of them, they had double-digit leads.
Yeah, I was feeling pretty good for Auburn when they were 6-2. And, I really thought they had a good chance to compete with Bama for the West. Like, I really thought the Iron Bowl at the end of November was going to decide the West. And obviously, that just everything changed drastically. And so, I'll be interested to see where they go from here. What do you expect as far as the quarterback for next season?
I don't know, Joe. I mean, I was expecting them to go out and get somebody in the transfer portal, but so far it hasn't happened yet. And I feel like it's moved so fast in the transfer portal that if they hadn't gotten somebody yet, then I don't know if it's going to happen. I've heard that Zach Calzada and Auburn have mutual interest in each other, but I don't know that that would be a real upgrade over what you have in TJ Finley. I thought Calzada was at best a decent game manager, very tough, but he had one good game. And that was against Alabama. And I watched him play against Auburn, and while he was tough is different than good. You know what I'm saying? And he didn't really put up a great performance there. And so, I mean, unless you're getting Caleb Williams or something like that, I don't really see them upgrading the quarterback position that much in the transfer portal. Now, they did get a 4-star quarterback that I think was the number 1 quarterback in the state of Georgia, Holden Jariner, who's coming in as a true freshman next year out of Savannah. And he's got really good measurables, a really good pocket passer who does have the ability to run a little bit, who might be interesting, but it's hard for me to, see him as a day 1 starter. So we'll have to see. I mean, I think right now we're probably going to have TJ Finley be the starter unless they get somebody in the transfer portal.
It's been interesting to see with the portal, if anybody enters it kind of like getting closer to spring practice, maybe some, players enter like a new coaching staff and they're not as happy, with the new staff. And I could still see some more players, getting out there in the portal, but probably more than likely Finley, to your point.
Yes. The only bright spot I will say of Auburn's first season is I was really pleased with Derek Mason as the defensive coordinator. There weren't really many games the entire season where I was disappointed in what he did. Maybe the Penn State game, I thought that didn't seem like we had a lot of good blitz packages right there and we didn't get a lot of pressure. But I don't really think that there was ever that many instances outside the Mississippi State game, which obviously they blew a 28-3 lead. I would say that would be the worst performance he had all year. But that was really the only game the entire season where I really thought that Mason didn't adapt well and didn't have his defense prepared. And so definitely he was the shining spot of Auburn's first year under the Harsin era.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And Joe, speaking of Penn State, they lost a real shocking game and a really sad game too, because just like Auburn's season and like Ole Miss's season, which we'll mention, they got marred by a quarterback injury multiple times. So Sean Clifford, of course, got injured when they were playing Iowa when they had the lead, and then Iowa came back and beat him. He was out for 3 or 4 games. They can never really get it back after that. And at the end of the season, he's in this game playing in the Citrus Bowl looking great. They're beating Arkansas, and then he gets hurt again, and Arkansas comes back and beats them. And I just felt so bad for Clifford, who, really just had an injury-riddled year. But good news for Penn State fans, he's also coming back for his 6th season.
Yeah, I mean, he'll be back. And so Penn State, will be, a factor. They'll be ranked, I think, throughout next season, definitely be a contender somewhat in the Big Ten. And then Arkansas, just the emergence with Sam Pittman, KJ Jefferson, I really think he has the potential to be the 2nd or 3rd best quarterback in the league next year after Bryce Young. So, yeah, I really like what Pittman's doing at Arkansas.
Hey, Joe, so apparently we'll talk about this more in the next segment, but since the transfer portal now is apparently free agency, you think that Lane ought to take the short drive over to Sardis and see if he can talk to KJ's family and get him to transfer to Ole Miss?
That'd be a good one. I mean, I'll say this. I mean, I was surprised they didn't already get their quarterback in the transfer portal. They were linked to Dylan Gabriel, I believe, before Levy left for Oklahoma. And then, of course, Gabriel said he was going to USC, and then I think now he's going to Oklahoma. So, I mean, I'd still be surprised if it's Altmaier. I think Altmaier's a pretty good quarterback, but I still would prefer somebody else, to be on campus too for competition.
Well, can I say this, Joe? Let's talk about this Ole Miss Baylor game. Of course, Matt Corral, and what is a very uncommon move nowadays, actually plays in the Sugar Bowl game, even though he's going to be a first-round draft pick, and it's not a playoff game. And he never apparently even had thoughts of not playing in it. And, of course, he suffers an ankle injury early in that game against Baylor, which I think most of us who were watching closely knew it wasn't a serious injury, but knew that it was one where he wouldn't come back. I mean, I'm pretty sure that what happened is when he was in that 10 and when he went to the locker room, they're like, listen, your x-rays are negative and you probably can go out and play. It's just, do you think you should at this point?
Mm-hmm.
And I think he made the right decision, definitely not playing after that. But, Joe, the biggest question I have of that game, Baylor had a great defense. We couldn't run the ball on them. Do you think that maybe Kiffin should have urged Corral to go ahead and opt out? And that way they could have had Altmaier actually prepared to be the starter in that game? Because you could see that he was not ready. He was not in a position where he could have succeeded in that position against that defense. And I think that Ole Miss probably would have won the game if Corral just went ahead and opted out a month and a half ago for that game. And Altmaier had the chance to actually get ready for it.
Here's what I would say about it. I feel like if Corral, is in that game, and I heard so many people say this, Ole Miss wins the game. Like, I just don't think, if he gets injured, Baylor wins based on the turnovers and the fact that Baylor's offense, didn't do much. Ole Miss's defense kind of quietly, had a great game, even though there's 21 points on the scoreboard. I can't fault Corral for playing, and the reason is this. In the grand scheme of things, even though the SEC teams, any program will say they want to win a national championship, I told my dad the other day that I objectively feel like 10-2, 11-2, if they win the Sugar Bowl, that's about as good as you can expect from an Ole Miss perspective. Mm-hmm. Like, I would love to say they can win a national title, but, Ole Miss for years has always had issues with depth against other teams in the SEC. It's just hard for them, through a season to go 11-1 or 12-0. And so in the grand scheme of things, given the fact that Matt Corral was going for what would be a historically great season for Ole Miss with 11-2 in a Sugar Bowl, I could see why that would be a little bit more unique for him playing compared to other programs that were eliminated from the playoff.
Yeah, I think so too, Joe. Now, like I said, I've got a lot of respect for him for playing. That was like the first thought in my mind after that game was I was like, man, if I'd known it was going to go like this, I wish you would have gone ahead and opted out earlier.
Yeah, I mean, it would have helped Altmaier if he had been the guy. That's a good point.
I mean, the biggest thing that I saw with Altmaier is I thought his arm looked very good, but there were a lot of opportunities he had to run it against that Baylor defense, which he didn't take because that's obviously not his skill set. Mm-hmm. And so, I think Corral would have definitely been able to get the rushing yards that Ole Miss was lacking in that game because I will give this to Baylor. Their defense completely shut down Ely and Snoop and all of our great running backs. I mean, what we had like 40 yards rushing in that game. I mean, it was a complete and utter lockdown.
Yeah. And that's one reason, you see Corral, a candidate to unfortunately get hurt is because, he felt like he had to run the football because nobody else could. And they also were kind of tightening up on the passing game too, even though Drummond did get, some yardage and he had the big pass to Braylon Sanders from Altmaier. But I kind of came away feeling like, Baylor's defense was better than I had given them credit for. They were outstanding. Disappointed to see Ole Miss lose, but still, 10-3 is better than I could have imagined 2 years ago when Lane Kiffin was hired this quickly. I mean, to get to this point. So a lot to still be excited about. But just a kind of a general takeaway, Dan, I noticed not only with Baylor beating Ole Miss, but like Mississippi State losing to Texas Tech, Oklahoma State beating Notre Dame. I've noticed that some of these Big 12 teams that are not going to the SEC, it's like they're playing these bowl games with a little bit of like a chip on their shoulder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they play great, man. The Big 12 had a great bowl season. And then Oklahoma just eviscerated Oregon with Bob Stoops adding just another win onto his total as the Oklahoma coach. And I thought that was a cool interim coach to have for a game. And, of course, I think the second touchdown of the game, Bob Stoops' son caught a touchdown. It was really cool getting to see father and son hug each other for a game that, obviously his son never thought he would get to be coached under his dad. So that was really cool how that worked out. But, I think I came away from this bowl season, even including last night's 42-20 win of Kansas State over LSU with what is admittedly a depleted LSU roster. What a great season for the Big 12. I don't know if they won the bowl challenge or not this year, but I got to say that in terms of meaningful games, they won all of them. They
did. And, a couple of their future teams, Cincinnati and Houston and UCF, they had not Cincinnati, but Houston and UCF, they got bowl wins too.
Yeah, that was a huge win right there. I mean, I think that's kind of a good one to go out on. We'll talk about the semifinal games when we talk about the Alabama and Georgia game later to preview them. But UCF, I think their win over Florida in terms of their state and what it means may have been the most significant of all of the non-playoff bowl games, because for years UCF has been trying to play Florida. There's an argument to be made, and I think a very valid argument, that over the last 10 years, UCF has been a better football program than Florida has been. Florida, of course, they made the SEC championship game last year, but you go outside of that, we're looking at 10 years. They've never won an SEC championship. Every time they've been to the SEC championship game, they've got obliterated. They weren't good teams that made it there. Meanwhile, UCF has been undefeated. They beat Auburn, a very good Auburn team that had beaten number one Alabama and number one Georgia legitimately in a bowl game. The next year, they were undefeated, and Joe Burrow played out of his mind. It was the first time you saw the Joe Burrow you'd see the next season come out, and he beat UCF. And they were just that close from going back-to-back undefeated seasons. And, of course, I mean, they've been, they were good under Heupel. Last year under Gus, a little bit of a step back. But in this whole time, Florida has refused to play them. They made them some kind of, really ticky-tack elitist offer that you come to the Swamp twice to play us, and we'll go down there and play you once. And, of course, the UCF guy said, no, we're your equal. We want to have a 1-1, and they wouldn't do it. And finally, the first time that UCF gets to play Florida, they beat them. They beat them pretty handily. Bowser ran all over them, and I thought that was just a great moment for UCF football and getting to stick it to the big brother there for a second.
Oh yeah. I think that was a game where we both had UCF. Just felt like they were just so up for that game, and that Florida, was just not. It's a shell of what they were under Urban Meyer. But the interesting thing about UCF for next year is there's some speculation that John Rice Plumlee, who entered the transfer portal this week, he may transfer to UCF.
I think Gus Malzahn would love to have a quarterback like John Rice Plumlee. I mean, he would fit so well within that offense. I mean, he's kind of like a Nick Marshall to an extent. I mean, it's a very similar kind of athlete to what you have with Nick Marshall. And I think he would actually flourish in a Gus offense, because we know one thing about Gus Malzahn. Either you have to be a perfect specimen of a quarterback sent down from the gods like Cam Newton for it to work out, or you just have to be an amazing athlete like Nick Marshall for it to work under you. Any other quarterback won't succeed with Gus Malzahn. And Plumlee, like I said, could be a lot like Nick Marshall. So
yeah, 1,000-yard rusher, 2 years ago.
That's right. So that's a good thing to look at. All right, Joe, when we come back, we're going to look at first the results of our bowl pool, and then we're going to go into how the game of college football is not what we used to love, how it's been corrupted by the transfer portal that doesn't have anything, by opt-outs, and maybe we can pitch some ideas for solutions. And I hope all of y'all are around for that. And I want to wish everybody a happy new year. You can catch all of our episodes on Spotify. Now we've got our YouTube channel. Look at the Dan Joe Sports Show on YouTube. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter at DJ Sports Show, and like us on Facebook on our Facebook fan page. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.